The one that begins regarding the voluntary meal offering starts with a soul who will offer. Nefesh ki sakriv. Again, not a typical way of saying a person. That's certainly the implication, right? How many souls on board the ship is how many people. In this regard also, a person who will offer. But technically, the denotational translation is a soul, nefesh. The question is, how come it says it in this paragraph regarding the voluntary meal offering? And if that's appropriate, whatever the reason might be, why does it not say that regarding the land animal burnt offering and the fowl burnt offering? Where's the consistency? The person who would give the voluntary meal offering as opposed to the land animal or the fowl offering is one who can't afford the land animal or the bird. It's a pauper. And as much as certainly you pay a lot less for a bunch of flour with maybe some olive oil and frankincense than, a bird and certainly than a land animal, the reality is that in most cases, somebody who is so poor that he can only afford some of that flour is actually tightening his belt a lot more in purchasing that extra flour that he himself isn't going to eat, he himself isn't going to benefit from physically, versus the rich guy who can buy an extra animal, or a semi-rich guy who can buy an extra bird. Therefore, the verse is implying that the person who really reveals his soul, who really reveals his inherent and internal dedication to God, is the one who actually brings the voluntary meal offering, not the land animal or fowl offering. And in that case, he's revealing his soul. So therefore, the verse in introducing that paragraph starts with the word nefesh. All voluntary meal offerings also contained olive oil and frankincense. The third aliyah. The Torah describes the last type of voluntary meal offerings, the deep-fried meal offering, and the mandatory barley offering, the omer offering, brought on the second day of Passover. That's the reason why we call the 49 days from Passover until Shavuot counting the omer, because it's been X amount of days since the omer offering was brought. Omer had to be barley. Barley, even though it's one of the 5 grains, and can be eaten certainly by a human being. In fact, you can make matzah from it for Passover. The Code of Jewish Law says that it's really not ideal to make matzah from barley because it's animal food. It's what an animal would eat much more than what a person would eat. Something like wheat, especially white wheat, is what we make matzah from because that's the nicest kind of grain. Certainly you can make from oats and from barley and from spelt, that's all true, but barley generally is categorized as animal food. If that's the case, and if it's not as nice as wheat, why in the world would there be a requirement to do an offering using barley? Every offering is supposed to be the nicest possible offering to God. So, if, let's say, a person can't afford it, fine. But this is a requirement from the beginning. In other words, whether the nation is the richest nation in the world or the poorest paupers in the world, the omer offering is required to be barley, which is animal food. In the process of leaving Egypt, we not only left the geographic location of Egypt and the servitude that being there included, but we actually began transforming our midas, our character traits, to be ready to accept the Torah, to receive and accept the Torah on Mount Sinai. In fact, if you look at your prayer book, and when we relatively soon are going to be counting the Omer, every single one of the nights that we count the Omer, in addition to actually counting X amount of days from the Omer, we mention a particular combination of midas, of character traits. In that on that day, spiritually and even psychologically, we can and must improve that particular characterization, that particular character trait in our psyche. Because this is on the second day of Passover, the very beginning of that process, where we have really not yet worked on ourselves at all, we start with animal food. At that point, we are closest to our animalistic selves. And so, we start with barley, which is the food for animals. God instructs the Jews to add salt to every animal sacrifice or meal offering, a symbol of our everlasting salt covenant with God. Salt covenant sounds very strange. It is everlasting. You've noticed Friday night or Shabbat during the day, and really this should happen anytime you have a meal, that when you have bread, you dip it in salt when you say the blessing on bread hamotzi. That's because even though now we of course don't have a temple and we don't have the altar, our tables, our dinner tables, are considered the miniature or kind of the extrapolated altar in our day and age. And so therefore, just as there was salt on the actual altar when there was an actual offering, there should be salt when we have a meal, which is again to be as an offering to God, using the energy of that food for God's service. But why salt? The Arizal explains that based on the words of the sages, which define 4 categories of creation. In all of the created things in the world, you can delineate them into 4 categories. Inanimate objects, stones, vegetation, trees, animals, and the human being. Interestingly enough, the human being there is not called human being or person, but rather called medaber, meaning speaker. The big thing that distinguishes us from the animals, even though we have an animalistic side, is that we can speak. The implications of that, of course, are connected to the fact that God spoke in creating the world. But that notwithstanding, when we consider offerings, the human being, of course, is the one who's bringing the offering. That category is covered. There are plenty of offerings that are animal offerings. That category is covered. There are plenty of offerings that include or are in and of themselves vegetation. For example, flour from wheat or frankincense or olive oil. All of those things are from vegetables. But until and unless we have the salt, we actually don't have a component that is from the inanimate object. And therefore, salt must be included on all of the offerings. We are also commanded not to include any leavened items or anything which contains honey in any temple offering. There are 2 exclusions to the leaven prohibition. The simple reason why leaven is inappropriate for the offerings is based on the distinction between leaven, chametz, which of course is prohibited on Pesach, and matzah, which replaces it. The Talmud tells us, and again this is the law in the Code of Jewish Law, that the grains that make chametz are the grains that you can make matzah from. So, for example, something like soy flour cannot become chametz. Technically, even if you put water and it sits there and whatever, it's not considered chametz. I'm not talking about the practice of not eating certain things called kitnis. I'm talking about actual Talmudic adjudication. So therefore, you cannot make matzah out of soy and use it to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah. Matzah can only be made from the 5 grains, the same 5 grains that, if left with water, become chametz. So there is a fundamental interrelationship between chametz, leaven, and matzah. Except that one takes that grain, or the flour of that grain, and becomes poofed up, whereas the other is flat. Even in the spelling of the words chametz and matzah, we see the same distinction. Both words have a mem, so we can eliminate that, common. Both words have a tzaddik, we can eliminate that too. The only real difference in the spelling of chametz and matzah is a chet for chametz and a hey for matzah. And even when we look at the shape of the chet versus the hey, they're basically the same, top, a crossbar, connected to a right leg. But the difference, of course, is that for the chet, the left leg is also connected, whereas the hey, there's a little gap on the top left corner, and the left leg is disconnected. In essence, if the human being is standing within a chet, he has no window to anything above him. What he is, what he's decided, what he has learned is what matters. The only thing he's interested in is influencing anybody and everybody below him. He doesn't consider anybody above him or anything above him. That's rather haughty. And therefore, chametz, the word that has that chet, is poofed, is inflated, like our ego. Matzah with the hay, of course, leaves that little opening in the upper left-hand corner, so a person, as it were, standing or represented by the hay, does consider something above him and will and wants to accept effluence from something beyond him, from God. That level of humility is what's required not only on Passover, for the whole of the nation, for every single individual in their own houses, but in the temple, being that we're offering offerings to God throughout the rest of the year. Our sages tell us a very interesting bit of information from which you can learn a very powerful lesson regarding honey. The incense, if we were to have added a little bit of honey to it, the Mishnah tells us that no one could have resisted its smell. And nevertheless, we do not do so, because God says no leaven and no honey should be an offering for God. Okay, so in essence, on the simple reading, even though you might have a good idea as to, look, we want the nicest smelling stuff for God, and therefore, let's add a little honey. It'll be so good that nobody could resist it. You don't do that because God said no. God is the one who dictates how we serve him. We don't dictate how we serve him. That's the simple implication of the Mishnah beyond the practical delineation of what to do in the temple. But the terminology in the Mishnah is key. The terminology of can't resist it or wouldn't be able to resist it is literally translated as a person could not stand before it. The colloquial or connotational translation is couldn't resist it, but the denotational translation is couldn't stand before it. So based on the denotational translation, in essence the sages are saying that if we were to have added honey to that mix, a person smelling it would faint. So if that's the case, there doesn't need to be a question, why don't we add it? We wouldn't be able to add it because immediately we would faint. We couldn't stand before it. And if it's physically impossible, therefore, to add it and survive, why does the Torah have to tell us, don't put any honey in here? Why is this a question in the first place from the Mishnah? The explanation is that a Jew should be ready to the level of self-sacrifice for God's sake, in this case for the sake of the incense, that even if it would mean he's fainting, he would be ready to put the honey in. It's only because the Torah says don't do it that he doesn't do it, not because of the inherent danger to self. The fourth aliyah. The peace offering, the shlamim sacrifice, shalom is peace, shlamim is just the plural of that, is described in this aliyah. The shlamim, which could be brought from cattle, sheep, or goats, was shared by the altar, which consumed some of the animal's fats, the kohanim, the ones who actually processed the offering, and the donors of the sacrifice who were given the bulk of the meat. It's called shlamim, or peace offering, because, as the sages term it, it made peace between those three components. The Mishnah tells us that the world stands on three things: on Torah, on service, and on kind deeds. Torah, of course, comes from God down to us. Service is us for or towards God, whether in the form of prayer or in the form of offerings or in the form of any kind of service of God. And then kind deeds, of course, are between two or more individuals. It's between you and your fellow. In this scenario, we have the same exact setup. The three components fill those three roles, those three directions. The altar is where God's flame came down from above and consumed the offerings, just like the Torah, from above down to below. The person who brings the offerings, obviously, is the one who is bringing from below up to above. And the Kohen is the one who engenders peace between the two, engenders an interrelationship, especially when we consider the characterization by the sages of Aaron, and really all of the Kohanim by extension, in that they made peace between people. Aaron made peace between two people who were arguing, a husband and wife who were arguing, etc. So in that regard, these three components that the peace offering makes peace between are the three directions that we learn about in the Mishnah. The Aliyah ends with the prohibitions against consuming blood and the specific fats which were offered on the altar. Again, blood is passion, specific fats, the kind of, I forgot what the word is, more like bulbous, spherical fats that are in the animal, are a representative of pleasure. They were to be offered on the altar because any kind of passion and pleasure that we have in life should be for God's sake. These prohibitions apply to all animals, even those not offered in the temple, even those when the temple doesn't even exist. And so to this extent, we have salting of the animal once it's been slaughtered and properly processed, etc., so that the blood should be brought out, should be drawn out through osmosis. By the same token, we have what's called nikur, that we cut off the back half of the animal, and even those that don't cut off the back half of the animal, according to some traditions, that's fine. They have a specific place where they cut out all of the prohibited fats as well as the sciatic nerve. The fifth aliyah. We now begin learning about the sin offering, the chatat sacrifice, brought by an individual who is guilty of inadvertently transgressing a sin. From here until the end of the Torah portion, every single one of the categories of offerings that is discussed are all about some kind of a misdeed. Sometimes inadvertent, sometimes individual, whatever the details are, it's something that happened that's wrong. And we'll note that every single one of the offerings is described as an offering for, or a flame for, or the bread of Hashem. There are many different names for God, each one of them delineating a particular role that he plays in relating to the world. If we were considering offerings that are because of sin or guilt or some kind of a misdeed, it stands to reason that they should be for God as he is our judge. But in the scenario that we read, every single one of these is considered an offering or something of the like to Hashem, to the four-letter name of God. The four-letter name of God is described as the name that bespeaks God's mercy. And therefore, when these offerings are made, they bank on, they draw from an inherent connection to God that actually transcends any kind of misdeed or kind of disconnect that happens because of sin. And therefore, we can effectuate an atonement using these offerings. It seems odd that a person would have to offer an offering, a sacrifice, because he inadvertently transgressed the sin. If it were on purpose, that makes sense, right? I have to atone for something that I did. But it was an accident. If it's an accident, I didn't do it on purpose, so why should I, I'm sorry, but it wasn't my fault, as it were. The reality, however, is that everything in this world happens by divine providence. Nothing happens by chance. And so, when a person inadvertently transgresses, they have to actually evaluate or analyze their spiritual standing. God made it that they should, again, not on purpose, but nevertheless, that they should make a sin. And specifically because it's inadvertent, and it was basically above their head, above their control that it happened, that means that there's something actually very serious to atone for, and therefore the sin offering, the chatat sacrifice, is the first offering that is discussed in this section of the Torah portion. This section discusses the unique chatat sacrifices brought by a high priest who sins, by the Sanhedrin, who issues an erroneous ruling which causes the populace to sin, and a monarch who sins. We'll notice that these three are all leaders. Leaders, whether on the level of spirituality, the high priest, the practical adjudication of Torah law, the Sanhedrin, or the practical leader, the material leader of the Jewish people, the king. We'll note that there is a very peculiar verbiage, syntax, that's used to begin the section that deals with the monarch who sins and the sin offering that he brings. It says, Asher, that's the first word, Asher Nasi, when a king, a monarch, a prince will eventually sin. Asher usually translates as which or that. Usually you don't start a sentence with that or which. Like a proclamation is written as whereas something or other. But that is specifically awkwardly or specially worded in order to draw attention to it. So if that's the case here, what is the attention that's being brought? The word asher, which actually relates to the Hebrew word for happy, ashrei. Osher is to be happy. And so the sages tell us that a nation who has a king that doesn't sweep under the rug his mistakes, he's the king who's going to challenge him. In this scenario, he admits to the fact that he made a mistake and offers this offering, and therefore the nation who has such a humble and God-fearing king should be happy. The sixth aliyah. The Torah discusses the fourth and final type of chatat, that of a common person who sins. Also discussed is the karban oile v'yored, a vacillating sin offering, meaning going up and down, brought by an individual guilty of certain specific sins. For example, not testifying when he should, or testifying falsely. The vacillating sin offering depended on the financial position of the transgressor. A wealthy person brought a sheep or goat. A person of lesser means brought 2 birds. And a pauper brought a meal offering. There is a very interesting law that says that a person can in fact pledge the vacillating sin offering, the value of the vacillating sin offering of a different person. So here, it's vacillating based on the financial position of the person who needs to bring it. If, let's say, a rich person needs to bring the offering, he obviously brings the highest cost of the offering, the first category, sheep or goat. If it's a poor person, to the opposite extreme, he brings a meal offering. Fine. The person who needs to bring it is no longer obligated to bring it if someone else pledges the value of that offering in his place. And if everything lines up, there's no question. A rich person who needs to bring the offering is replaced by somebody who is also rich who pledges it. They're obviously bringing the rich offering. A poor person who is replaced by somebody who is also poor, they're all obviously bringing the poor offering. That makes sense. That's straightforward. But what if, and this is only a Jewish mind could ask this, let's say that a rich person needs to bring the offering and a pauper pledges it in his place. He has to bring the rich offering. And you might say, well, that makes sense because he's pledging to bring the value of the rich man's offering. But if the scenario is reversed, it's a poor person who really needs to bring the offering, but the person who pledges it, who wants to be in his place, is a rich person. Based on the previous logic, you'd say that he should bring a poor person's offering because that's what he's replacing. But the law is that he brings a rich person's offering. So you basically can't win. Whether it's the original person or the replacing person, they have to bring a rich offering. Why is that? This is where the statement of our sages comes in and says that Kol Yisrael orevim ze lo ze. Every Jewish person is responsible one for the other. And therefore, we basically are one entity with different parts. A different wording of that same statement is Kol Yisrael orevim ze bo ze, with a bet instead of a lamed, which basically translates as every Jewish person is intertwined with each other. Not just responsible from a legal perspective or even a moral perspective, but a spiritual intertwining. And now it makes sense. As soon as it's the rich person who originally has to offer it, it has to be a rich offering. As soon as it's a rich person who wants to replace the guy who pledges it, they're one entity, and now a rich part of that entity is involved. A rich offering has to be brought. The seventh aliyah. This section concludes the laws of the carbon Eilav V'Yedid, the vacillating sin offering. We then move on to the last sacrifice discussed in this week's Torah reading, the guilt offering, the Asham sacrifice. 3 types of guilt sacrifices are discussed. An Asham brought by one who inadvertently misappropriates temple property. An Asham brought by one who falsely swears regarding money owed to another. In addition to bringing a sacrifice, these 2 individuals must repay the principal amount and pay a punitive fine equal to 1/4 of the principal. And C, an Asham brought by a person who is uncertain whether he violated a Torah prohibition. If he's uncertain, maybe he didn't violate. Why do we assume that he violated and all of a sudden needs to bring an offering? But that's actually not the mechanism. We don't assume that he violated. We think of the scenario when a person would be uncertain if he violated or not. The only way that you can be uncertain of something important is if you're actually not considering it that important at all. I'm uncertain whether I ate today or not. Apparently eating isn't all that important, otherwise I'd know that I ate or I didn't. If a person is uncertain whether or not he violated a Torah prohibition, apparently Torah prohibitions aren't all that important to him and therefore he's uncertain. In that kind of a scenario, he obviously needs atonement and therefore he brings this offering. Being that it's the Shabbat before Purim, Purim is next week, Wednesday night, Thursday during the day. One of the special Torah readings throughout the year is the Shabbat before Purim called Zachor. In addition to the regular Torah portion, obviously, that we just discussed, we will have a special, how can I obliterate the memory and at the same time not forget? Obliterating the memory means forgetting, and not forgetting means always remembering. So what does God want from us? The memory of a Molech is in essence the legacy of a Molech. A Molech is numerical out. And so that cooling factor, that cooling influence of doubt is to be eradicated specifically by remembering. The very distinction of remembering versus learning is that when I'm learning something new. When I'm remembering, I'm recalling something that's already deep inside of me. Remembering, therefore, is recalling who I am fundamentally. Remembering my Jewish identity, my essential connection to God. And that will always overpower any kind of cooling effect that doubt might have.